The year was the middle of the war. A dusty truck rattled along a broken road, carrying men and women who had just been captured. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rumbling engine and the nervous breath of tired prisoners sitting shoulder to shoulder. For some of them, this was the first time they'd been so close to their enemy, and honestly, it didn't feel real yet. One soldier, his uniform still half torn, whispered to the guy next to him, "Maybe they're taking us somewhere safe." The other prisoner didn't reply. He already knew better. As the truck rolled up to the gates, the prisoners saw tall fences wrapped with barbed wire, watchtowers on every corner, and guards carrying rifles. A chilling silence hung in the air. One thing became painfully clear: this was not somewhere safe. The first glimpse. The gate creaked open slowly. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stood like tired soldiers themselves, leaning from years of use. A muddy path cut straight through the middle of the camp, puddles everywhere, and the sharp smell of smoke hung in the air. The guards shouted instructions in a language many prisoners didn't even understand. Some stood frozen, trying to figure out what was happening. Others kept their heads down, hoping they wouldn't be noticed. And then, there was a different kind of silence. Among the prisoners were women, nurses, messengers, civilians caught in the chaos of war. They whispered among themselves, voices trembling. Stories had already spread from other camps. Some women had been mistreated, taken away at night, never returning. Nothing graphic was ever spoken aloud, but the fear was real. It wrapped around them tighter than the barbed wire itself. Every time a guard walked past, they held their breath. In a place like this, safety wasn't promised to anyone. A world without answers. Everyone had the same question: how long will we be here? But of course, nobody knew. Some thought the war would end soon, maybe a few weeks, maybe months. Others had already accepted that this camp might be their home for a very long time. That's the hardest part about being captured. Not the fences, not the guards, but not knowing what tomorrow looks like. One soldier, his uniform still half torn, whispered to the guy next to him, "Maybe they're taking us somewhere safe." The other prisoner didn't reply. He already knew better.
The strip of land that felt like another planet. Inside the camp, time moved differently. It was only a few hundred meters wide, but it felt like another planet. You could see freedom right beyond the fences. Green fields, trees, sometimes even a small road in the distance. Birds flew over the barbed wire as if mocking the people trapped inside. It was strange. The outside world kept living, but inside the camp, life froze. The guards handed out prisoner numbers and divided people into groups. From that moment, names almost didn't matter anymore. To the camp officers, everyone was just a number, a bed, and a bowl of soup. Settling into the unknown. The new prisoners were led to their barracks, small wooden huts with thin walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. The inside smelled of damp straw and old clothes. Each person got a rough blanket, a straw mattress, and a small metal cup. That was it. No personal space, no privacy. You could hear every cough, every quiet sob, every whispered prayer at night. One young soldier wrote in his diary later, "It wasn't the hunger that broke me first. It was hearing 20 men cry softly into their pillows when they thought everyone else was asleep." Fear in the shadows. Night came quickly in the camp, and with it came more silence. The lamps burned low, shadows stretched across the walls, and the muffled footsteps of guards echoed outside. The women huddled together, whispering. They knew the rumors, and they feared being singled out. Some wrapped themselves in old coats, trying to look less noticeable. Others tried to blend into the background, keeping their eyes down whenever a guard passed. This wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity, about trying to hold on to some sense of control when the world had taken almost everything away.
A different kind of strength. Despite everything, people adapted faster than you'd think. That's the strange thing about humans. Even when everything is stripped away, we find ways to keep going. Some prisoners whispered jokes at night just to hear laughter again. Others shared stories about their homes, their families, their children. A few even started carving small marks into the walls to count the days. One woman told a small group around her, "Every sunrise means the world hasn't ended yet, and until it does, we keep breathing." For a moment, everyone nodded. In a place designed to break people, tiny words became shields. The weight of silence. By the second night, something else became clear. Silence in the camp wasn't peaceful. Outside the fences, you could hear distant sounds of war, explosions far away, gunfire carried by the wind. Inside the camp, silence meant fear. Every small noise, a door creaking, a boot scraping the dirt, made people sit up and listen. One prisoner joked quietly, "This is the first time in my life I've prayed for insomnia." A few chuckles escaped, but deep down, nobody really slept well. The unseen battles. What broke people most wasn't the hunger, the cold, or even the guards. It was the battle inside their own minds. Some prisoners replayed the moment they were captured over and over, wishing they'd made different choices. Others kept thinking about their families, not knowing if they were alive or safe. And yet, somehow, hope survived here, a tiny spark that refused to go out. Sometimes it came from a letter, sometimes from a shared joke, sometimes from a simple reminder. One day, this will end. The first night ends. The camp eventually went quiet. One by one, people drifted into uneasy sleep, clutching thin blankets against the cold. In the dark, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else silently wiped away tears. And far away, a guard's boots crunched on gravel, reminding everyone that tomorrow would bring the same fences, the same rules, the same fight to stay human. But beneath all that fear and exhaustion, there was still a quiet strength building, a kind of unspoken promise between the prisoners. We survived today, so we can see tomorrow. Morning came. But honestly, it didn't feel much different from night. The sky above the camp was gray, and the air smelled like damp wood and smoke. A rusty bell clanged loudly outside, dragging everyone out of their straw beds. "Wake up! Wake up!" the guards shouted, in a language most prisoners didn't even understand. But you didn't need a translator to figure it out. Tone works in every language. People slowly shuffled out of the barracks, still half asleep, still half hoping this was all just a bad dream. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The morning roll call. The first thing every prisoner learned, roll call was sacred. It didn't matter if you were sick, injured, or had just discovered your mattress was basically a sack of itchy straw. When the bell rang, you got in line. The guards counted everyone, one by one, over and over again. If the numbers didn't match, they kept counting until they did. Rain, snow, heat, it didn't matter. Prisoners could stand outside for hours until the guards were satisfied. One old prisoner joked softly to the man next to him, "I used to be bad at math, but after this camp, I'll graduate with honors." The guy next to him didn't laugh, but only because his lips were frozen. Breakfast, if you can call it that. After roll call came breakfast. And yes, I'm using quotation marks on purpose. The menu was the same almost every day. A tin cup of watery soup and a slice of stale bread so hard you could probably build a house with it. The soup? Well, calling it soup was generous. Imagine boiling old vegetables, removing the vegetables,
and serving the leftover water. Voila! Prison camp gourmet. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd find a mysterious thing floating in the soup. Was it meat? Was it not meat? Nobody asked questions. People just ate quietly, saving every crumb of bread like it was treasure. One prisoner once said, "Hunger teaches you two things: how to chew slowly and how to be grateful for even the worst soup on earth." The barracks. Home sweet home. After breakfast, prisoners returned to their wooden barracks. Calling them rooms would be an insult to rooms everywhere. Each barrack was packed with people. No privacy, no silence, no personal space. You could hear everything. Coughing, snoring, arguments about who stole whose bread, and sometimes crying muffled into a pillow. The beds? Wooden planks with straw mattresses that smelled older than history itself. Blankets were thin, scratchy, and never enough during winter. Some prisoners shared them just to stay warm. Despite all this, the barracks became more than just shelter. They became tiny worlds of survival. People talked, whispered stories, and even made jokes to make the nights feel shorter. Rules, rules, and more rules. Life inside the camp came with an endless list of rules. Walk too slowly? Punished. Speak too loudly? Punished. Look at a guard the wrong way? You guessed it, punished. But here's the twist. The rules changed depending on who was in charge. One guard might ignore you for whistling softly. The next one would make you scrub the entire yard with a toothbrush. Prisoners quickly learned a secret skill: watching faces. You could tell from a guard's walk, his tone, or even how he held his rifle if today was a good day or a stay invisible day. Work assignments. By mid-morning, prisoners were divided into work groups. Some repaired fences, others carried heavy logs, and many were sent outside the camp to dig trenches or build roads. The work was exhausting, but strangely, some people preferred it. Why? Because working meant movement, and movement meant staying warm. It also gave prisoners a glimpse beyond the barbed wire, a tiny taste of the outside world. Of course, others dreaded work. One man joked, "I came here with 10 fingers. If I leave with 8, I'll call it a good deal." Dark humor, yes, but in a place like this, it kept people sane.
Tension between guards and prisoners. Not all guards were the same. Some were strict, even cruel, barking orders without a second thought. Others, well, they were just people, stuck in a terrible situation too. A few guards occasionally slipped extra food to starving prisoners or looked the other way when someone broke a small rule. These tiny gestures felt huge, like little sparks of humanity hidden in a place designed to crush it. But, of course, kindness was rare. Most guards kept their distance, and prisoners quickly learned not to test boundaries. The wrong word at the wrong time could mean no food, no rest, or worse. Rumors in the camp. With no radios, no newspapers, and almost no letters from home, rumors became the camp's unofficial news channel. Someone would whisper, "The war's almost over." An hour later, another person would swear, "No, it's getting worse." People clung to any scrap of information, real or imagined, because hope needs something to hold on to. Even lies felt comforting sometimes. The women's silent struggle. Among the prisoners, the women faced an additional layer of fear. It wasn't just the hunger or the cold, it was the constant worry about being targeted. Some guards harassed them with words, others with stares that said too much. Women tried to make themselves less noticeable, wrapping extra cloth around their heads, avoiding eye contact, staying close to trusted groups. Nothing was ever spoken loudly, but everyone knew the risks. And yet, somehow, they endured. In whispered voices, women comforted each other, shared blankets,
and made quiet promises. We survive this together, finding tiny joys. Here's the thing. Even in the darkest places, people find small ways to stay human. Some prisoners carved little pieces of wood into toys or tiny animals, trading them for scraps of bread. Others taught each other songs from home, humming softly at night to drown out the silence. One man drew sketches in the dirt every evening. Nothing fancy, just little drawings of mountains, rivers, and his childhood home. He once said, "If I can see it in my head, it's almost like I'm there." These small acts weren't just hobbies, they were lifelines. Nights in the camp. When night came, the barracks turned quiet. Some prayed softly. Others stared at the ceiling, lost in thoughts of home. Far away, you could hear dogs barking and boots crunching on gravel. Sometimes the distant sound of explosions rolled through the air, reminders that the war outside hadn't stopped. In the darkness, people whispered little pieces of themselves, memories of warm kitchens, summer fields, and loved ones they hoped to see again. The camp was cold, but inside those whispers, there was still warmth. A strange kind of strength. By the end of the first week, prisoners started adapting, not because they wanted to, but because survival leaves no other choice. They learned which guards to avoid, which ones might secretly help. They figured out where to hide extra crumbs of bread. They learned how to read the sky for weather changes and how to keep warm using nothing but shared body heat. Life in the camp was brutal, yes, but somehow people still found ways to hold on to pieces of themselves, memories, jokes, faith, and quiet dreams of freedom. Because in a place where the world tried to strip everything away, holding on to your humanity became the ultimate rebellion. If you ask anyone who lived through a World War prison camp what they remember the most, you might expect them to say the guards, or the fences, or the endless rules. But surprisingly, many of them will give the same answer in one word: hunger. Not the kind of hunger where you skip lunch and complain later. This was the deep, empty, gnawing hunger that sat in your stomach like a stone and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." Breakfast, if you're lucky. Mornings started with a bell and a cue, and sometimes, only sometimes, it ended with food. Breakfast was usually a thin, watery soup and a slice of bread that felt older than the camp itself. If you were really lucky, the bread didn't have mold. If you were unlucky, well, you just scraped it off and ate it anyway. One prisoner once joked, "If the mold's alive, at least it's extra protein." People laughed, but also, they still ate it. Hunger doesn't care about pride. The soup mystery. The soup was its own legend. Nobody really knew what was in it. Some days it tasted faintly like cabbage, other days like potatoes, and sometimes like absolutely nothing at all. One man swore he once found a piece of meat in his bowl. Nobody believed him until he showed it. 10 prisoners gathered around staring at this tiny piece like it was treasure. And then he dropped it. In the dirt. Gone forever. For weeks after that, people whispered, "Remember the meat incident?" It became camp folklore, a tragic, tiny love story between a starving man and his lost lunch. Trading and bargaining. Hunger made everyone creative. Food became currency. A crust of bread could be traded for a button, a shoelace, or even protection from work duty. Some prisoners built tiny black market networks right under the guards' noses. They'd secretly swap dried potato peels for leftover soup, or trade a cigarette for an extra sip of coffee. One clever prisoner even carved small chess pieces out of wood. He'd challenge people to play, and the winner got a spoonful of soup from the loser's bowl. You'd be amazed at how seriously people played when food was on the line. The women's quiet struggle. For women in the camp, hunger came with added burdens.
Some gave up their own food to protect children or sick relatives. Others hid tiny scraps of bread under their clothes, saving them for someone weaker. And then there were moments of heartbreaking kindness. One night, an older woman split her bread into 4 tiny pieces and gave it to 3 children she barely knew. When asked why, she simply said, "Because they're still growing. I stopped growing a long time ago." In a place built to strip away humanity, small acts like this kept hope alive. Desperation in the shadows. Of course, hunger didn't just bring out kindness, it also tested people's limits. Sometimes prisoners argued over crumbs. Friendships broke under the pressure. There were nights when someone would wake up to find their piece of bread missing, stolen in the dark. The guards didn't care. To them, it was just prisoner against prisoner. But inside the barracks, these tiny conflicts could feel huge. Hunger made tempers short and trust fragile. One man later wrote in his diary, "It wasn't the fences or the rifles that made us feel trapped. It was the empty stomach. There's nowhere to run from that."
Strange things hunger does to you. After a few weeks, prisoners notice something strange. You start thinking about food all the time. People talked about meals they used to have at home, described recipes in detail, argued about the best way to cook potatoes, and even dreamed about warm kitchens and full plates. One prisoner said he could still taste his mother's stew in his mind, even though he hadn't had it in years. Another drew pictures of cakes and bread on scraps of paper, passing them around like tiny works of art. These conversations were bittersweet. On one hand, they gave people comfort. On the other, they reminded everyone of what they'd lost. The occasional feast. Every once in a while, the camp kitchen served something different. A spoonful of beans, an extra slice of bread, maybe even a small piece of fish. On those rare days, people lit up like it was a festival. They'd savor every bite, chewing slowly, holding on to the moment for as long as possible. But here's the thing, hunger doesn't take days off. By nightfall, the emptiness returned, louder than before. Smuggling and risk. Some prisoners worked outside the camp, repairing roads or digging trenches. On good days, they'd sneak small scraps of food back, a raw potato, a stolen carrot, even a tiny onion. Smuggling food was dangerous. If caught, the punishment was harsh. But people still tried because sharing one stolen potato among 4 starving friends was worth the risk. One prisoner joked, "I never thought I'd risk my life for an onion, but here we are." The others laughed quietly because honestly, same. The power of sharing. Despite the desperation, something incredible happened. People still shared. A man with one slice of bread would split it in half. A woman with a spoonful of soup would let her friend drink first. Not everyone could give, but when they did, it wasn't just about food. It was about reminding each other, we're still human. The camp hasn't taken that from us yet. That kind of solidarity became a quiet form of resistance. Guards controlled the fences, the food, the work, but they couldn't control kindness. The weakest among them. Hunger hit the sick and elderly the hardest. With so little nutrition, even small illnesses became dangerous. Some prisoners gave up their food for someone weaker, hoping to save them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. And every time someone didn't make it, the entire barrack felt it. People sat in silence, staring at their bowls, suddenly aware of just how thin the line between survival and loss really was. The mental battle. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The body can survive weeks without proper food, but the mind? That's where the real fight happens. When your stomach growls for hours, it's not just uncomfortable. It breaks your focus, your patience, your hope. Every sound, every smell, every thought somehow circles back to one question: when do we eat? Prisoners learned tricks to cope: drinking extra water, chewing slowly, distracting themselves with songs or stories. But deep down, the hunger never truly left. Holding on to humanity. By the end of the first month, hunger became part of life. It didn't get easier, you just got used to it. But even in the middle of scarcity, something powerful survived: community. People helped each other stay alive, not just with food, but with hope. Someone would whisper, "The war can't last forever." Another would answer, "We'll eat like kings one day." And for a moment, everyone believed it, because when there's nothing left to give but words, words become everything. If hunger was the first enemy in the prison camp, weather was definitely the second. The camp didn't care whether it was summer, winter, rain, or snow. Life went on the same way. But for the prisoners, every season came with a brand new set of problems and some surprisingly creative solutions. Winter, the Great Freezing War. When winter arrived, it didn't just get cold, it got unfriendly. The wind cut straight through the thin wooden barracks, making it feel like the walls didn't exist at all. Prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: old coats, pieces of torn blankets, even newspapers stuffed under their shirts for extra insulation. Some of them joked, "Congratulations, you're now a human sandwich." The mornings were the worst. Waking up meant leaving the relative warmth of a shared blanket and stepping onto freezing floors that felt like ice blocks. The water buckets outside turned solid overnight, and some mornings even the soup for breakfast arrived half frozen. The art of layering without layers. Most prisoners owned just one set of clothes. No spares, no sweaters, no winter jackets. If you ripped your shirt, you either stitched it up or wore it like that. So, prisoners got creative. They used scraps of cloth, cut up sacks, and even straw from their mattresses to stuff inside their shirts and pants for warmth. Imagine looking like a walking scarecrow. But hey, when your teeth are chattering, fashion isn't exactly a priority. Some tied socks around their hands to make gloves. Others shared body heat at night, sleeping back to back like human heaters. You'd be amazed how warm two freezing people can make each other when the temperature drops below zero. Fire, the rare luxury. Fires were allowed in only specific areas, and fuel was scarce. A small camp stove burned in the kitchen, but prisoners rarely got close to it. Every now and then, though, someone managed to sneak a tiny fire inside the barracks using scraps of wood or paper. It was risky. If the guards caught them, punishment was harsh. But on the coldest nights, that little glow of heat felt like magic. One prisoner later wrote, "I don't remember what we talked about those nights. I only remember the sound of our hands rubbing together and the relief of feeling my fingers again." Frostbite and fear. Winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Fingers, ears, and toes were at constant risk of frostbite. When the first signs appeared, numbness, pale skin, blackened edges, there was little anyone could do. There were no proper medicines, no warm gloves, no doctors with fancy equipment. Prisoners relied on each other, rubbing frozen hands until the feeling returned or sharing the last scraps of warmth they had. Some didn't make it through the coldest weeks. And yet, somehow, people kept going. Not because they weren't suffering, but because they refused to stop fighting. Summer, the other extreme. Just when prisoners thought winter was the worst thing imaginable, summer showed up and said, "Hold my soup." The heat inside the camp was relentless. The wooden barracks turned into ovens by midday. The thin roofs trapped the heat, making it hard to breathe.
People sweated through their clothes, but couldn't change because, well, one set of clothes. Water became the most precious thing in the world. Buckets were rationed, and sometimes prisoners stood in long lines just for a single sip. One prisoner sighed once and said, "I'd sell my blanket for an ice cube right now." Nobody disagreed. The endless dust. Summer brought another problem: dust. The ground inside the camp turned dry and cracked under the heat, and every step kicked up clouds of fine dirt. By the end of the day, everyone was coated in a thin layer of brown. People joked that the camp was giving out free tanning services, but honestly, it wasn't funny after a while. Dust in the lungs, dust in the soup, dust on the bed. It was everywhere.
Beating the heat, prisoner style. Just like winter, prisoners got creative during summer. They soaked their caps or shirts in water and tied them around their heads for a few minutes of relief. Some dug tiny holes in the ground, sitting inside them during the hottest hours because the earth was cooler underground. Others stayed close to the shadows of the barracks, moving slowly to conserve energy. And when there was no water left, prisoners would trick their minds by rinsing their mouths with nothing but air, pretending it was cold water. It didn't really work, but at least it distracted the brain for a moment. The monsoon madness. In some camps, the worst days weren't winter or summer, it was rainy season. When it rained, it really rained. The ground turned into endless mud, the barracks leaked from every corner, and the paths became rivers. Prisoners walked barefoot through ankle-deep puddles, socks soaked, clothes heavy with water. At night, the dripping sound from the roof made sleep nearly impossible. But sometimes the rain was secretly a blessing. Prisoners collected droplets in cups, using them for drinking or washing. One man joked, "Finally, something free in this place." The clever tricks of survival. Over time, prisoners became experts at surviving extreme weather. For winter, sharing body heat, stuffing straw in the clothes, and wrapping feet with cloth strips. And using tiny hidden fires. For summer, soaking clothes, digging cool pits, staying in shadows, and saving every drop of water like gold. For rain, using broken pieces of metal sheets to make makeshift funnels, collecting clean water wherever possible. Nothing was easy, but small hacks like these kept people alive, and maybe, more importantly, gave them a sense of control over their lives when everything else felt powerless. How weather affected hope. Here's the strange thing. Weather changed the mood of the entire camp. In winter, people were quieter, conserving energy, speaking softly while wrapped in blankets. In summer, tempers flared faster. Exhaustion made even small arguments feel huge. During rainy nights, some prisoners felt calmer, the sound of falling water giving them rare moments of peace. Survival wasn't just about enduring the temperature, it was about enduring what it did to your mind. A little humor, a little humanity. Even in the harshest moments, prisoners found ways to laugh. One freezing morning, a man shouted, "Whoever invented winter, I'd like a word." Another replied, "Find me the guy who invented summer too. I've got questions." These tiny jokes mattered. They didn't change the weather, but they made the burden lighter for a while. In a place designed to break spirits, even one shared laugh felt like a victory. The unseen strength. Surviving the cold, the heat, and everything in between wasn't about physical strength. It was about endurance. Prisoners learned to accept discomfort, to adapt, and to keep going even when their bodies wanted to quit. They shared warmth, shared water, shared hope,
And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected. Even in a place designed to take everything away, people still found ways to care for each other. And that quiet, stubborn kindness, that was stronger than any winter wind or summer sun.
If hunger made life painful and the weather made it miserable, loneliness made it unbearable. Inside the prison camp, fences kept you in, guards kept you down, but it was the connections between prisoners that kept people alive. Some friendships started on the first day, others took weeks, but eventually almost everyone found someone to lean on, because surviving alone in a place like this was nearly impossible. The first conversations. At first, nobody talked much. Everyone was exhausted, scared, and unsure of who they could trust. People kept their heads down, whispering only when necessary. But slowly, that changed. One night, in the freezing barracks, a young man hummed a song under his breath, something soft, a tune from home. A few prisoners nearby recognized it and quietly joined in. By the end of the week, 10 men were softly singing the same song together in the dark. No instruments, no lyric sheet, just quiet voices carrying memories of a world outside the barbed wire. That was the beginning. It started with music, but soon people began trading stories about their homes, families, and dreams. A little warmth returned to cold nights. Trust is everything. Inside the camp, trust was currency. If you trusted the wrong person, you could lose your food, your belongings, even your safety. But when you found someone you could depend on, everything changed. Friends shared rations, guarded each other's sleep, and warned each other about dangerous guards. One former prisoner later said, "A single loyal friend in camp was worth more than gold. You gave them your last crumb, and they gave you theirs the next day." That's how we survived. Even the smallest gestures, saving an extra sip of soup, giving someone half a blanket, or standing next to them at roll call, built bonds stronger than steel. The women's circles. For women prisoners, forming bonds wasn't just helpful, it was essential. They created small support circles inside the barracks, quietly looking after each other. If one was sick, others tried to hide it from the guards to avoid punishment. If someone lost her bread, another would secretly share half of hers. Some women even braided each other's hair at night as a way to stay sane, whispering stories about life before the war. It wasn't just friendship, it was a silent promise. You are not alone.
Acts of kindness that saved lives. One night, a prisoner named Leon collapsed from exhaustion. His friends took turns carrying him to the barrack, risking punishment if the guards saw. Another time, a woman hid a piece of potato in her pocket for 3 days just to give it to a child on his birthday. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, quiet acts of humanity, but in a place where cruelty was common, they felt enormous. The unspoken language. Over time, prisoners developed ways to communicate without words. A quick glance meant, "Be careful, the guard's angry today." A subtle nod meant, "I saved you something." A tap on the shoulder meant, "Follow me quietly." These silent signals built trust even between people who didn't speak the same language. One former prisoner said, "I didn't know his name, didn't know his country, but I knew he'd share his bread if I asked. That was enough." Storytelling in the dark. At night, after the guards passed, prisoners would gather in small circles, whispering stories from home. One man described the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, and for a moment, everyone could almost taste the bread. A woman talked about playing by a river as a child, and the whole group could hear the water in their minds. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were reminders of life before the fences and promises of life after the fences. Laughter as resistance. Believe it or not, there was laughter in the camp too. It was rare, but when it came, it was powerful. One freezing morning, a guard yelled at a group for walking too slowly. A prisoner muttered under his breath, "Sorry, my legs didn't get the memo." Everyone around him tried to hide their smiles. Little jokes like these weren't just funny, they were defiance. When you laughed, even for a moment, you were saying, "You haven't broken me yet."
When bonds save lives. There are countless stories where friendship literally meant survival. A man who gave his last drop of water to a sick friend, and the friend lived. A group of prisoners who hid another from punishment by claiming he was with them during roll call. Women who took turns staying awake at night to guard each other. These weren't heroes from movies. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, proving that humanity survives best when it's shared. What they learned. By the end of their time in the camp, many prisoners said the same thing. Food kept their bodies alive. Hope kept their minds alive. But friendship kept their hearts alive. Even decades later, survivors remembered names, faces, and voices from the camp more than anything else. Because in a place where everything was designed to strip away identity, connection gave it back. A whispered promise. One night, a small group huddled together in the dark, shivering under a thin blanket. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then someone finally whispered, "One day, we'll sit at a real table again." A second voice answered softly, "With real bread." A third added, laughing quietly, "And soup with actual vegetables." For a moment, everyone smiled. In a camp filled with fences and fear, they built freedom inside their minds. The shared burdens. There was an unspoken rule among close friends. No one suffered alone. If someone got sick, others covered their work duties. If someone had nightmares, someone else stayed awake beside them. When bad news arrived in letters from home, if they arrived at all, there were arms ready to hold the person who couldn't stop crying. This wasn't just kindness, it was survival strategy. In a place designed to crush the human spirit, sharing pain made it lighter. Danger of betrayal. Not every bond was perfect, of course. Desperation made some prisoners do terrible things, stealing food, spreading rumors, or reporting others to guards in exchange for favors. Those moments hurt the most, not just because of the betrayal, but because trust was rare and precious. After such incidents, prisoners became more cautious, but somehow they still kept trying. Because even in a world filled with fear, people wanted connection, faith in each other. Religion gave some prisoners strength, but faith in each other kept many going. Small circles formed, praying together, or just sitting in silence when words failed. Sometimes all someone needed was a hand to hold. Sometimes a quiet nod said, "I'm here. I see you." One woman later said, "I thought faith meant believing in God, but in the camp I learned it also means believing in people." If the fences kept prisoners inside and the guards kept them quiet, then secrets became their last weapon. Inside the camp, whispers carried more power than shouting ever could. In a place where every word was dangerous, prisoners invented hidden languages, silent signals, and clever tricks to pass messages right under the guards' noses. And honestly, some of their ideas were pure genius. The art of saying nothing and everything. At first, prisoners just whispered when the guards weren't around, but soon they realized even whispers could be overheard. So they got smarter. A simple scratch on the wooden bedpost meant, "Meet me outside." A folded corner of a blanket meant, "I saved you some food." 3 taps on the barrack wall, that was code for guard nearby, stay silent. One prisoner joked, "We've invented a whole new language here. Too bad we can't sell the dictionary." Messages in plain sight. Sometimes the most effective hiding place was the one nobody questioned. Prisoners started hiding messages in everyday objects. Scraps of paper tucked inside empty soup bowls, carved symbols under wooden benches, tiny notes written on the back of ration tickets. Some women sewed messages into the hems of their dresses, stitching words so small you'd need a magnifying glass to read them. The guards thought they controlled everything. The prisoners quietly proved otherwise. The laundry code. One of the smartest tricks came from the laundry lines. Each shirt, blanket, and towel had its place, and prisoners began arranging them in patterns that carried meaning. A blanket hung upside down meant stay away from the yard. 2 shirts folded on the left meant meeting after roll call. A missing towel, that was code for something's wrong. To the guards, it looked like messy drying clothes. To the prisoners, it was an entire invisible conversation flapping in the wind. The power of rumors. Not all information was about escape plans or survival tricks. Sometimes it was about hope. Prisoners whispered about the progress of the war. Someone would claim they overheard a guard talking about an approaching victory, and that tiny spark of maybe could keep people going for days. Of course, not all rumors were true. Once, a man swore the camp would be liberated next week. Everyone was excited, spirits lifted, until next week came and went. After that, they joked about it. Careful, don't believe Tom. According to him, we've been liberated 5 times already. Food smuggling secrets. Remember the trading networks from Chapter 3? Secrets made them possible. Prisoners working outside the camp would pass hidden signals to let others know when they'd managed to sneak in food. A knot tied in a shoelace meant check under the mattress. A pebble placed on the windowsill meant bread behind the water barrel. It sounds simple, but in a place where being caught meant punishment, these tiny details could mean the difference between going to bed hungry or having a single stolen bite of freedom. Spying on the guards. Some prisoners became experts at observation. They learned the guards' routines, when they patrolled, when they smoked, which ones were lazy and which ones were dangerous. They memorized every detail. Which guard checked the fences less often? Who left their keys dangling too close to reach? Who liked to talk after a few drinks, letting secrets slip without realizing? One prisoner joked quietly, "We know the guards better than they know themselves." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Songs that spoke without words. Music became another secret weapon. Prisoners created simple songs, singing them softly while they worked or rested. To the guards, they sounded like harmless lullabies or folk tunes, but hidden inside the lyrics were coded messages. A song about birds flying south really meant someone escaped successfully. A lullaby mentioning stormy nights meant punishment coming, stay cautious. It was communication disguised as art, and it gave prisoners a little piece of power back. The secret libraries. Despite the constant fear, knowledge still flowed through the camp. Prisoners built tiny libraries in hidden corners, swapping books and handwritten notes. Old newspapers smuggled in from outside were passed around carefully, each page read until the ink nearly faded. Maps were sketched from memory, copied and hidden in the soles of shoes. Even a single word from the outside world felt like gold. It reminded them that there was still a world beyond the fences. Escape planning. Not every secret was about food or safety. Some were about freedom.
Groups of prisoners whispered late at night, drawing tiny sketches of tunnels in the dirt, planning routes, memorizing guard schedules. They knew the risks. If caught, the punishment could be deadly. But hope is stubborn, and the thought of breathing free air again was worth the danger. Most plans failed. Some never even started. But just having those plans, believing that escape was possible, gave people something priceless: purpose. How the guards never knew? Here's the crazy part. Most of these secrets lasted the entire war without being discovered. Why? Because the prisoners became masters of acting ordinary. They laughed when they needed to laugh, looked busy when they needed to look busy, and pretended everything was normal, while entire networks of hidden communication ran right under the guards' noses. In a place where control was absolute, finding even a tiny way to outsmart the system felt like victory. The bond of shared secrets. Secrets didn't just move information, they built trust. If you shared a hidden signal or passed someone a coded note, you were risking your safety. That risk created powerful connections between people. A single shared secret meant, "I trust you with my life." And in the camp, that was no small thing. Little victories, big meaning. Every time a message was passed, a rumor spread, or a small rebellion succeeded, it reminded the prisoners of one thing: we are not powerless. The guards had the rifles, the fences had the barbed wire, but inside those fences, the prisoners built an entire hidden world of their own, a world the guards couldn't touch. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about outsmarting the system one tiny step at a time. Life inside the prison camp was a daily battle, and not just against hunger, weather, or disease. There was another, constant challenge: living under the watchful eyes of the guards. Some guards treated prisoners like enemies, others treated them like insects, but a few, just a few, behaved like humans. And in a place built on fear, those rare sparks of kindness meant everything. The weight of authority. From the moment you entered the camp, you knew one thing: guards ruled everything. They decided when you woke up, when you ate, when you worked, and when you rested. Even your smallest movements, sitting, walking, whispering, happened under their control. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made people sit up straight instantly. You didn't want to stand out, and you definitely didn't want to attract attention. One prisoner summed it up perfectly: we didn't live by clocks, we lived by footsteps. The cruel ones. Some guards seemed to enjoy holding power over starving, exhausted people. They shouted at prisoners for walking too slowly, punished them for speaking out of turn, and sometimes forced them to stand outside for hours in the freezing cold. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control, reminding everyone who was in charge. One morning, a prisoner accidentally dropped his bread. A guard crushed it into the mud with his boot and said, "Guess you're fasting today." Moments like that stayed with people forever. The indifferent majority. Interestingly, not all guards were cruel. Many were just there. They stood at their posts, barked orders, and followed routines without much thought. To them, prisoners were numbers, not names. They didn't go out of their way to help, but they didn't go out of their way to hurt either. For the prisoners, these indifferent guards were the safest to deal with. No unexpected punishments, no unnecessary drama. Just follow the rules and keep moving. One prisoner whispered once, "I like him. He ignores me." In the camp, being ignored was a blessing. The unexpectedly kind ones. And then there were the rare ones. The guards who acted human. They didn't shout as much. Sometimes they looked away when a prisoner pocketed an extra crumb of bread. A few even whispered quiet warnings like, "Don't go near the yard today." One guard secretly slipped a woman a boiled potato when he noticed she hadn't eaten for days. Another left the water tap accidentally open near the barracks during the summer heat wave. These small acts didn't change the system, but they reminded prisoners that kindness could survive anywhere, even behind barbed wire. The strange friendships. Occasionally, guards and prisoners developed quiet understandings, relationships built on mutual respect rather than orders. One prisoner spoke the guard's language and sometimes acted as a translator. Over time, one of the guards began sharing scraps of information about the war's progress in exchange for small favors, like fixing a broken radio. Another prisoner, a shoeraker, repaired a guard's boots. The guard didn't thank him. That would have been forbidden, but the next morning, the shoemaker found an extra slice of bread on his bed. It wasn't friendship in the normal sense. It was survival, disguised as cooperation. Women under watch. For women, guards posed an additional, constant threat. Some leered, some harassed, and others abused their power in cruel ways. To protect each other, women stuck together in tight groups. They avoided walking alone, stayed close to older prisoners, and developed silent strategies to avoid attention. Sometimes, sympathetic male prisoners formed protective shields, walking beside the women during work assignments to keep them safer. These unspoken alliances didn't stop every danger, but they gave strength to those who felt most vulnerable.
Moments of humanity. Every now and then, something unexpected happened. A moment that blurred the line between prisoner and guard. One freezing night, a young guard noticed a prisoner shivering violently. Without a word, he tossed his own scarf on the ground and walked away quickly, pretending it was an accident. Another time, after a long workday under the summer sun, a guard let prisoners rest in the shade for 5 minutes, pretending he'd lost track of time. Tiny gestures, small kindnesses, and yet they were remembered for decades. The silent battles. Not all resistance came in tunnels and escape plans. Sometimes it came in tiny acts of defiance right in front of the guards. Prisoners would deliberately take longer to finish assigned tasks, forcing the guards to wait. Some walked slower, just to prove they still had a choice, even in the smallest way. It wasn't about winning, it was about dignity. One prisoner whispered to his friend once, "They control my body, not my thoughts." And that quiet, stubborn refusal to break, that was its own kind of victory. The guard's side of the fence. Here's the thing. Some guards didn't want to be there either. Many were just following orders, drafted into service without much choice. Some avoided eye contact, kept their distance, and did only what was necessary. A few guards were barely older than the prisoners themselves. Young men caught in a war they didn't start. One former prisoner said, "I saw fear in their eyes too." Different kind of fear, but it was there. It didn't excuse cruelty, but it explained why not all guards were the same.
When power shifts. Near the end of the war, something fascinating happened in some camps. As the outside world changed, so did the guards. Some became stricter, more paranoid, barking orders louder than before. Others became strangely quiet, almost nervous. Rumors spread quickly. The war's turning. They know it. For prisoners,
It was a strange reversal. Suddenly, the people who had total control over them started showing cracks in their confidence. It gave hope where there hadn't been any before. Living between fear and hope. For prisoners, life under the guards was a constant balancing act. Stay invisible, but stay human. Obey the rules, but protect your dignity. Avoid punishment, but look out for each other. It was exhausting. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, waiting for the smallest mistake to bring consequences. And yet, within that tension, people found ways to survive, not just physically, but emotionally. They built trust with each other, created secret codes, and even found kindness in unexpected places. Lessons from both sides. Years later, many survivors reflected on this strange, complex relationship. Some guards were cruel beyond words. Some were indifferent, following orders like machines. A few were quietly compassionate, helping in small ways when they could. But for the prisoners, one truth became clear. Power can control bodies, but it can't control humanity. Inside the fences, surrounded by fear, the smallest gestures, a shared crumb, a warning glance, a scarf left by accident, were enough to remind people they were still human. In a place where fences trapped your body and guards tried to control your mind, there was one thing that could still reach prisoners from the outside world: letters. Small pieces of paper, fragile envelopes, a few handwritten words from someone you loved. And yet, inside the camp, those words carried the weight of entire worlds. The day the mail arrived. Mail days were rare, sometimes once a month, sometimes less. But when the rumor spread that letters had arrived, the entire camp felt different. Prisoners stood in long lines, holding their breath, waiting for their names to be called. Some gripped tiny scraps of hope in their fists. Others stayed silent, afraid of disappointment. A single envelope with your name on it could feel like winning a war of your own. The first touch. Imagine this. You've been trapped in a camp for months, maybe years. Every day feels the same. And then, suddenly, a guard calls your name and hands you an envelope. Your fingers tremble. Your heart beats louder than the bell for roll call. You trace the handwriting like it's a photograph of home. For a few seconds, the fences disappear. You're back in your kitchen, smelling warm bread. You're standing in your childhood street, hearing familiar voices. That letter isn't just paper. It's freedom in disguise. Words that kept people alive weren't long. Censorship rules meant families could only write short, safe messages. No details about the war, no complaints, nothing that could upset morale. But somehow, those few sentences carried everything. We miss you. We're safe. Stay strong. One prisoner later said, "A single line from my mother gave me the strength to survive another month."
When there was no letter. But not everyone got one. For every prisoner who smiled with tears as they read, there was someone else standing empty-handed, staring at the ground. No name called, no envelope waiting. Those were the hardest days. People tried to hide their disappointment, but you could see it in their faces, in the way they walked back to their barracks a little slower than usual. Some whispered excuses to themselves. Maybe the mail was delayed. Maybe they didn't know where to send it. But deep down, the silence hurt more than hunger. Shared letters. In the camp, letters belonged to everyone. When someone received one, they didn't just read it, they performed it. They'd gather close friends around at night and read the words softly, almost like a bedtime story. Even if the letter wasn't for you, Hearing someone else's news gave you hope. If one person's family was alive and safe, maybe yours was too. Sometimes prisoners memorized their letters word for word and whispered them back later, holding on to the sound like a song they didn't want to forget. Parcels from home. Very rarely, parcels arrived. Small boxes filled with things from loved ones. Sometimes it was socks. Sometimes a bar of soap. Sometimes a little sugar wrapped in paper. But most precious of all, food. A small piece of chocolate could turn into a treasure. One prisoner once received a tin of butter cookies. He didn't eat them all at once. He didn't even eat them every day. Instead, he shared them, one tiny piece at a time, making them last for weeks. He later said, "That box of cookies wasn't just food. It was proof that someone out there remembered I existed."
Hidden messages. Of course, letters and parcels weren't always just letters and parcels. Some families developed clever tricks to send hidden signals. A tiny dot above a word meant, "We're in danger." A repeated phrase meant, "Someone has been lost." A piece of cloth inside the box meant, "Stay strong. Help is coming." Prisoners studied every mark, every fold, every strange word choice like detectives. In a world where news was forbidden, even a misplaced comma felt like a secret code. When letters became memories. Not everyone read their letters once and put them away. Many prisoners carried them everywhere, folded into the smallest possible squares and hidden in pockets, shoes, or under mattresses. When nights were long and silent, they'd pull them out, tracing the handwriting over and over until the words blurred. Some memorized entire letters and repeated them like prayers before sleeping. The paper might fade, the ink might smudge, but the hope inside stayed alive. The letter that never came. Some prisoners waited for letters that never arrived. Weeks turned into months, months into years. One woman whispered every night, "Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow never brought an envelope with her name on it. For many, that silence was its own kind of suffering. They didn't know if their families were safe, if their homes still stood, or if there was anyone left to write at all. Even without words, that absence changed people. It made some colder. It made others cling harder to friendships inside the camp, creating new families where old ones felt lost.
Letters that broke hearts. Not every letter brought joy. Some carried terrible news. One man received a single line, "Your brother has fallen." Another got a letter saying his family's home had been destroyed. There was no privacy for grief. Inside the crowded barracks, tears were shared like everything else. People sat together silently, holding the one who had lost everything. In a strange way, sorrow became communal. Nobody carried it alone. The power of hope on paper. The truth was simple. A letter couldn't feed you, couldn't free you, couldn't change the rules of the camp. But it could change you. It reminded prisoners they weren't forgotten. It gave them something to hold on to when the nights were long and the days were endless. One survivor said decades later, "I don't remember the guards' faces. I don't remember the taste of the soup. But I remember my father's letter. Every word. It kept me alive." The last letter. In some camps, the final weeks before liberation brought an unexpected flood of mail. Families had finally found addresses, parcels were rerouted, messages delivered too late. Some prisoners received their first letter only days before freedom came. One man read it over and over again until the paper tore in half. He held both pieces separately,
as if touching them kept the connection alive. Years later, he still had those scraps. Faded, fragile, but priceless. A world beyond the fence. Letters were proof that life existed beyond the camp, that there were still warm kitchens, green fields, children playing, and people waiting. Every envelope, every sentence, every carefully folded page whispered the same thing. You are not lost. We're waiting for you. And sometimes, that single promise that someone, somewhere, still cared was enough to keep a person breathing.
In the prison camp, hunger and cold were constant enemies, but there was another silent killer moving through the barracks: illness. A cough here, a fever there, and before anyone realized, entire rows of beds were filled with prisoners too weak to stand. Inside fences already built to trap people, sickness built invisible walls of its own. The perfect storm. The camp was the perfect place for diseases to spread. Crowded barracks, damp straw beds, barely any soap, almost no clean water. People slept shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same air, the same blankets, and sometimes the same spoons. A single cold could sweep through an entire barrack in a week. Fevers spread faster than rumors. One prisoner later said, "If one man sneezed, the whole camp shivered." The usual enemies. Some illnesses became camp regulars. Flu and fever, constant companions during cold nights. Dysentery from dirty water and spoiled food. Skin infections caused by lice, fleas, and endless sweat. Pneumonia, the biggest killer during winter. There were no masks, no vaccines, no antibiotics. Sometimes survival wasn't about treatment, it was about luck. The fight for clean water. Water was precious, but it wasn't always safe. Buckets were filled from shallow wells or muddy streams outside the camp. Boiling water would have helped, but there wasn't enough fuel to make it possible for everyone. Prisoners came up with tricks to filter water using pieces of cloth, sand, or even crushed charcoal. It didn't always work, but it gave people hope, and hope was something you couldn't ration. The doctors without tools. Among the prisoners were doctors, nurses, and medical students, but without proper tools, even the most skilled hands were helpless. They improvised with whatever they could find. Splints made from broken chair legs, bandages torn from old shirts, salt water used as disinfectant. One former nurse remembered stitching a wound with thread pulled from a mattress and a needle sharpened on stone. She said softly, "We couldn't save everyone, but we tried. And sometimes trying was enough."
The medicine that wasn't there. Painkillers? Almost none. Antibiotics? Forget it. Most of the medicine prisoners had came from parcels sent by families. Tiny bottles of aspirin, small packets of herbs, or pieces of soap to wash wounds. Because supplies were scarce, medicines were shared carefully. One pill might be split between 3 people, dissolved in water, and given in sips. Some prisoners even risked punishment by trading food from medicine with guards or black market networks inside the camp. For many, one stolen tablet of penicillin meant the difference between life and death. The nurses nobody knew. Not all heroes wore uniforms. In many barracks, prisoners quietly took care of the sick, washing their faces with damp cloths, feeding them small spoonfuls of soup, and holding their hands through long nights. There were no titles here, no doctor or nurse labels, just humans helping humans. One survivor recalled, "I don't remember her name, I only remember her hands were warm and that she sat with me until my fever broke." The fear of contagion. Of course, sickness came with fear. Sometimes entire sections of the camp were isolated when diseases spread too quickly.
Guards avoided entering sick barracks, tossing food through doors rather than stepping inside. Prisoners faced an impossible choice: stay close to care for their friends, or stay distant to protect themselves. Most stayed close anyway. In a place where death already felt near, nobody wanted to let anyone face it alone.
The role of faith. When medicine failed, faith became the treatment people turned to. Some prayed softly in corners, asking for strength to survive another day. Others whispered blessings over the sick, passing hope from one person to another like an invisible medicine. One group of prisoners held secret gatherings every night, saying the same prayer together: "Let us see the sunrise tomorrow." And every sunrise felt like a small miracle. When children got sick. Among the civilians trapped in camps were children, and sickness hit them the hardest. A single fever could weaken a child for weeks. Mothers gave up their food rations to feed their little ones, hiding their hunger behind quiet smiles. When medicine wasn't available, they sang softly, held their children close, and hoped their warmth would be enough to keep them alive. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but they never stopped trying. Small victories. Every recovery, no matter how small, was celebrated like a festival. A man who stood up after days of fever. A child who survived pneumonia against all odds. A friend who smiled again after weeks of lying silent on the straw bed. One prisoner wrote later, "We didn't have parties, but when someone recovered, the whole barrack breathed lighter that night." These little victories gave the camp something priceless: belief.
The emotional toll. Illness didn't just attack bodies, it broke spirits. Watching a friend waste away slowly, powerless to help, left scars that lasted a lifetime. But strangely, it also brought people closer. Prisoners sat together through endless nights, sharing stories to distract the sick from pain, humming lullabies and holding trembling hands until the shaking stopped. In a place where everything was designed to strip away humanity, caring for each other became rebellion. The final goodbyes. When someone didn't make it, there were no funerals, no proper ceremonies, but prisoners still found quiet ways to honor the dead. A tiny cross carved into a wooden beam, a silent prayer whispered over an empty bed, a shared memory spoken softly so the person wouldn't be forgotten. One prisoner said, "In this place, even remembering someone's name felt like an act of love."
In the prison camp, hunger gnawed at your stomach, cold stung your bones, and illness weakened your body. But even then, the guards had one more demand: work. From sunrise to sunset, prisoners became laborers. Roads, fences, trenches, kitchens, factories. If there was something to build, clean, carry, or dig, the prisoners did it. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. Work without wages. Nobody got paid, of course. Work wasn't about money, it was about control. Every morning after roll call, prisoners were divided into groups and assigned tasks. Sometimes you'd end up fixing fences inside the camp. Sometimes you'd be sent outside to dig trenches under the blazing sun or freezing wind. Some jobs lasted hours, others lasted days, but there was one unspoken rule: work slowly, survive longer. One prisoner whispered to another, "Don't finish too fast, they'll just find something worse." A valuable piece of advice passed around like treasure. The jobs nobody wanted. Some jobs were tolerable: sweeping the barracks, cleaning the yard, or peeling potatoes in the kitchen at least meant staying indoors. But others were brutal. Carrying heavy logs for hours until your shoulders burned, breaking rocks under the sun with barely any water, digging endless trenches with rusty shovels, mud sticking to your hands and clothes. Latrine duty, the job everyone prayed to avoid. Rumor had it that prisoners used to trade entire bread rations just to avoid cleaning the camp latrines for a week. Inside the kitchens, kitchen duty was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it kept you warm and close to food. On the other, guards watched every movement, making sure not a single extra crumb left the pots. Still, clever prisoners developed quiet tricks, pretending to clean the ladle while secretly licking it, dropping accidental pieces of potato into someone's pocket, saving thin skins of vegetables to trade later. In a place where hunger ruled, even a stolen spoonful of soup felt like victory.
Working outside the fences. Some prisoners were sent outside the camp to repair roads, cut wood, or carry supplies. These assignments were physically harder, but they came with one unexpected gift. The sky felt bigger. You could see fields, trees, maybe even birds flying free above the barbed wire. It didn't make the work easier, but it reminded you there was still a world out there, untouched by fences and guards. Sometimes, locals from nearby villages secretly left food or letters along the paths. A potato hidden under a stone, a scrap of newspaper folded into a leaf. These small gestures became lifelines. Teamwork in silence. When you're weak, hungry, and exhausted, carrying a log twice your weight feels impossible. But this is where bonds between prisoners came to life. Friends walked slower so nobody got left behind. Two people would share one shovel, switching hands when the other grew tired. No words were needed. A nod, a glance, a hand reaching out when you stumbled. These silent partnerships kept people alive far more than rules ever could. Acts of quiet rebellion. Not every prisoner followed orders perfectly. Sometimes resistance hid inside routine. People dug trenches slower than ordered, carried fewer bricks, or swapped broken tools on purpose to delay work. Some even pretended to be sicker than they were, hoping to get hospital duty instead of back-breaking outdoor labor. One prisoner joked, "I've discovered the cure for back pain. It's called acting." Everyone around him tried not to laugh. You never wanted the guards to notice.
Dangerous work. Some tasks weren't just exhausting, they were deadly. Prisoners sent to repair damaged roads during bombings risked being caught between opposing armies. Others worked near explosives or unstable structures. In those jobs, prisoners relied entirely on each other. They warned each other about loose boards, shifting rocks, and dangerous tools. Even when survival was uncertain, they refused to face danger alone. The politics of good workers. The guards kept lists: who worked fast, who was lazy, who caused trouble. Being labeled a good worker sometimes meant lighter punishments and rare extra rations. But it also came with pressure. The guards demanded more from you every day. Some prisoners deliberately worked just well enough to stay invisible.
not too fast to stand out, not too slow to be punished. It became an art, blending in, staying unnoticed, quietly surviving. Women's workload. For women prisoners, the work was different but equally exhausting. They cleaned, washed clothes, sewed uniforms, and often worked in the kitchens or infirmaries. But they faced another burden: constant fear. Working near guards meant staying alert, staying in groups, and keeping their heads down to avoid unwanted attention. Among themselves, women formed quiet teams, helping one another finish tasks faster so no one was left behind at night. The hospital assignments. Some prisoners were lucky enough to be assigned to the camp infirmary, if you could call it that. There were almost no supplies, no proper medicine, and only a few beds, but at least the work was indoors and away from the harsh weather. Prisoner doctors and nurses cared for the sick with whatever scraps they had, boiling water for cleaning wounds, stitching injuries with improvised needles, and whispering reassurances they didn't always believe themselves. Working in the hospital didn't just keep you warmer, it made you feel useful in a place designed to strip away purpose. The longest days. The hardest part wasn't just the labor itself, it was how endless it felt. Digging, carrying, sweeping, peeling, hauling, and then waking up the next day to do it all again. Sometimes, prisoners lost track of time completely. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. For some, work became the only way to measure life. I've carried 300 logs since arriving here. That's how I count the days. It was exhausting, yes, but strangely, for a few, work became distraction, a way to keep the mind busy, to stop thinking about hunger, sickness, and fear for a few hours. Unexpected humor. Even in the middle of exhaustion, prisoners found ways to make each other laugh. One day, a guard yelled at a man for digging too slowly. Without missing a beat, the prisoner muttered, "Tell the ground to be softer then." The man's friend nearly choked, holding back laughter. In a place built to break people, even small jokes felt like rebellion. Hope hidden in routine. As strange as it sounds, daily work gave some prisoners structure in a world without freedom. Digging trenches, carrying wood, peeling potatoes, these became little anchors in an ocean of chaos, not because the tasks were meaningful, but because routine gave the illusion of normal life. And deep down, everyone knew the same thing. If I can survive today's work, maybe I can survive tomorrow too. Surviving together. By the end of every shift, prisoners were exhausted, drenched in sweat or rain, and covered in dirt. But walking back to the barracks together, they shared something the guards couldn't touch: solidarity. One man described it simply: "I carried his bucket when he fell. He shared his bread when I fainted. That's how we made it through." It wasn't strength or skill that kept people alive. It was each other. The quiet triumph. Years later, survivors looked back and said the same thing. The work was endless. The exhaustion was real. But they endured, not because they were strong, but because they refused to let each other fall. In a place designed to erase dignity, helping a friend lift a log or sharing an onion from the kitchen became acts of quiet rebellion. The guards controlled the labor, but the prisoners controlled their humanity. And that small victory mattered more than anyone realized. Inside the prison camp, fences locked bodies behind barbed wire. Guards controlled food, work, and even sleep. But there was one thing they couldn't control: what people believed. For many prisoners, faith became the strongest weapon against despair. Whether it was prayer, meditation, quiet rituals, or simply believing in better days, holding on to something bigger than themselves helped them endure what felt impossible. When the walls closed in.
At night, the barracks were silent, except for coughing, shuffling, and whispers. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, fear pressed down like heavy blankets. And in those moments, when hope felt far away, some prisoners turned inward. They whispered prayers softly into their hands. They traced familiar verses on the walls with invisible fingers. They repeated mantras passed down from childhood, clinging to words like lifelines. One survivor later said, "My faith didn't feed me, it didn't warm me, but it gave me a reason to wake up the next day." Prayers in secret. In many camps, religious practices were restricted. No gatherings, no open prayers, no candles or symbols. But prisoners found ways to keep their beliefs alive anyway. They whispered verses under their blankets so guards couldn't hear. They drew tiny symbols on scraps of cloth, tucking them inside their clothes for strength. Some created invisible chapels in quiet corners of the barracks, a small space where they could sit, close their eyes, and pretend they were somewhere safe. One man described it beautifully. "I built my temple inside my head. They couldn't take that from me." The shared faith circles. Over time, prisoners began forming small groups, quiet circles of faith hidden from the guards. A handful of people would gather in the evenings, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark. No chants, no rituals, no loud preaching, but just whispered words of comfort. Sometimes one person recited a prayer. Other times they simply sat in silence, holding hands, letting the warmth pass from one palm to another. One woman said later, "I didn't even share the same religion as most of them. But faith isn't about names, it's about surviving together."
Different faiths, same hope. The camps were filled with prisoners from different countries, different cultures, and different beliefs. Some prayed to God, others to Allah, others to nothing at all but hope itself. And yet, in those cold barracks, differences faded. A Jewish prisoner held the hand of a Christian. A Muslim whispered blessings over an atheist friend. A Buddhist shared meditation techniques to calm racing minds. In a place built to divide people, faith united them, not through religion, but through the shared belief that they had to keep going. Stories that carried strength. Sometimes faith wasn't just about prayer, it was about stories. Prisoners passed around tales from their holy books or cultural traditions, retelling them in soft voices late at night. A man who survived a desert against all odds. A woman who faced injustice but held her dignity. A group of people who escaped impossible suffering. These stories weren't just about the past, they became mirrors of the present. Prisoners saw themselves in the heroes and found courage in their endurance. Symbols of survival. Even without proper religious items, prisoners created tiny symbols of hope. A wooden cross carved from scrap firewood. A crescent drawn in the dirt and erased before morning. A tiny folded paper star tucked under a pillow. These little objects had no material value, but they carried enormous meaning. To touch them was to remember who you were and who you refused to stop being. Faith versus despair. Not everyone believed. Some prisoners lost their faith entirely, asking why a higher power would allow such suffering. Others felt abandoned, angry at the silence of heaven. And yet, even those without formal religion found themselves believing in something, a better tomorrow, a family reunion, an end to the war. Faith didn't always mean religion. Sometimes it was just refusing to let despair win. One prisoner summed it up perfectly. "I stopped praying to God. I started praying to tomorrow."
The role of rituals. Small rituals gave prisoners a sense of control when everything else felt chaotic. Some whispered the same prayer before each meal, no matter how small the portion was. Others marked imaginary holy days in their minds, quietly acknowledging them without candles or gatherings. Even simple actions, touching a pendant before work, tracing a name into the dirt, folding hands before sleeping, became powerful reminders that you are still you. Faith in each other. Sometimes the strongest faith wasn't directed upward, it was directed toward each other. Prisoners believed their friends would keep them alive, share their bread, protect them from danger, and carry them when they collapsed. When someone fell sick, others sat beside them, whispering promises. "You're not leaving us. We'll get through this." And more often than not, people did survive, not because of medicine or strength, but because someone believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. The prisoner who became a light. In almost every camp, there was someone, one prisoner, whose belief lifted everyone else. Sometimes it was a priest or an imam. Sometimes it was a teacher, a poet, or even just an optimistic stranger. They reminded people of the world outside the fences, told stories of freedom, and offered quiet comfort when fear crept in. One man became famous in his barrack for ending every night with the same sentence: "Tomorrow, the sun will rise again." It wasn't poetry, but it was enough. Faith as quiet resistance. For many, believing became a silent rebellion. The camp tried to reduce prisoners to numbers, erase their identities, and crush their spirits. But every prayer, every story, every whispered hope was proof that they were still human. A survivor explained it years later. "When I prayed, I wasn't just asking for strength. I was proving they hadn't taken my soul." The morning after a miracle. Sometimes faith gave prisoners the energy to face one more day, and then another, and another. One woman said she prayed every night for her sick child, promising she wouldn't stop until the fever broke. On the fifth night, the child finally opened his eyes. Decades later, she still called it a miracle, but more than that, she called it proof that hope itself can heal. Holding on. By the end of the war, many prisoners carried their faith out of the camp like a fragile flame. Some rebuilt their spiritual lives. Others walked away from religion entirely, but held on to the deeper lessons. The strength of community, the power of belief in tomorrow, the unbreakable spirit of hope. Inside the fences, faith didn't just mean religion. It meant choosing to believe there was still a reason to survive, even when you couldn't see it yet. Inside the prison camp, the fences were tall, the gates were locked, and guards stood watch day and night. But there's one thing fences can't trap: the human desire to be free. Even when escape seemed impossible, prisoners never stopped dreaming about it. Some plans were clever, some were desperate, a few worked, most didn't. But every single one of them started with the same thought: there has to be a way out. The whispered meetings. Escape plans didn't happen loudly. They started with quiet whispers in the darkest corners of the barracks. Two prisoners would sit side by side, pretending to repair shoes while trading coded phrases. The ground near the east fence looked soft. "I saw a guard leave his post yesterday. I think we can time the shift change." From there, a few trusted people would get involved, forming small escape circles. These groups worked in complete silence because one careless word to the wrong person could ruin everything. Tunnels in the dark. Tunnels were the most dangerous and the most fascinating escape attempts. At night,
Prisoners quietly dug under beds, scraping the earth with spoons, cups, and bare hands. They hid the dirt inside their clothes and scattered it outside during work assignments. One tunnel took 4 months to dig, inch by inch. The opening was hidden under a loose floorboard, and the path ran more than 30 meters under the camp fence. But on the night of the escape, disaster struck. A sudden rainstorm flooded the tunnel halfway through. The prisoners had to crawl back, soaked and shaking, while guards shouted outside, completely unaware of how close freedom had been. Later, one of them whispered, "I've never been so close to the stars and yet still trapped under the ground." Borrowed uniforms. Not every plan involved digging. Some prisoners tried something simpler, blending in. A few managed to steal or piece together guard uniforms from discarded jackets, hats, and boots. Dressed like soldiers, they walked straight past watchtowers at shift changes, acting confident and calm. One group even saluted a real guard while leaving. The guards saluted back, assuming they belonged there. They made it to the forest before anyone realized what happened. The next day, security doubled. But for a brief moment, the prisoners inside the camp felt a spark of hope. If they can do it, maybe I can too. The disguise of labor. Work assignments outside the camp also became opportunities. Some prisoners carried heavy logs or sacks beyond the fences, guarded by soldiers who quickly grew distracted. A few slipped away into nearby forests or villages, blending with locals as best they could. But these escapes came with enormous risks. If caught, punishment was severe, sometimes solitary confinement, sometimes worse. Still, people tried, because even the smallest chance of freedom felt worth the danger. The paper trail trick. In some camps, prisoners forged documents using scraps of paper, charcoal, and stolen ink. Fake work permits, travel passes, even official notes from guards. One daring prisoner once handed a forged slip to a real officer, pretending he'd been reassigned outside the camp. The officer barely glanced at it and waved him through. He didn't make it far, but for the rest of the camp, that story became legend, proof that cleverness could beat fences, even just for a little while. The night watches. Nighttime was both the best and worst time for escape. Best because shadows made hiding easier. Worst because guards were alert, dogs were restless, and silence made every sound louder. Some prisoners timed their movements perfectly, memorizing guard schedules and using cloudy nights for cover. Others tried crawling under the wire when dogs were asleep, pressing themselves flat against cold mud. A few made it out, most didn't. But every attempt gave others new ideas, new hope, and sometimes new allies. When trust was dangerous. The biggest threat to any escape plan wasn't fences or guards, it was betrayal. One careless word to the wrong person could destroy months of planning. Sometimes, prisoners desperate for favors from guards gave away secrets to protect themselves. One failed tunnel attempt collapsed after a tip-off. The guards filled the hole, doubled patrols, and punished the entire barrack. After that, escape circles became even smaller. Plans were whispered to only those willing to risk their lives together. The price of freedom. When prisoners were caught escaping, punishments were harsh. Some were beaten, some were locked in solitary confinement without food or blankets. Others were forced to stand outside for hours in the freezing cold as an example to the rest. Everyone in the camp saw these punishments, and the message was clear. Freedom costs more than you can afford. But here's the surprising thing. The escapes didn't stop. Because for many, the price of never trying felt even heavier than the price of failure.
The few who made it. Every camp had its legends, stories of prisoners who actually made it out and never came back. Sometimes you didn't know their names, just whispers passed from barrack to barrack. Someone made it across the river. 2 men reached the next village. They think she got on a passing truck. Even without proof, these stories kept hope alive. For every failed attempt, there was a possibility, however small, that freedom was still possible. Freedom in the mind. But here's the truth. Not everyone tried to escape physically. For many, escape happened inside their minds. They imagined walking home, smelling familiar kitchens, sitting at real tables again. Some built entire houses in their heads, decorating every room in detail just to remind themselves that life existed beyond the fences. One prisoner later said, "I didn't dig tunnels, I dug dreams." Sometimes dreams were the safest escape route of all. The guard who looked away. Occasionally, escape succeeded because of something unexpected. A guard turning a blind eye. Maybe he was tired of war. Maybe he saw himself in the prisoners. Maybe he simply didn't care anymore. One night, a young soldier pretended not to notice 2 men slipping under the wire. Years later, one of those men tracked him down after the war to thank him. The guard said only one thing: nobody should be caged forever. What escape meant. For most prisoners, escape wasn't just about leaving the camp. It was about proving that freedom still existed, that the fences, the guards, the hunger, and the fear weren't permanent. Every failed plan, every whispered rumor, every daring attempt carried the same message: we are more than prisoners. And in a place designed to erase hope, that message mattered more than success itself. The daydreams never stopped. Even for those who never tried, escape was always there. In quiet thoughts, in stolen moments, in dreams whispered softly under thin blankets. One day, we'll walk past these fences without looking back. One day, these boots won't crunch gravel anymore. One day, this will just be a story we survived. For some, that day came. For others, it didn't. But believing was its own kind of freedom. Life inside the camp was its own silent world. Days blended together, same fences, same routines, same hunger. But every so often, something reminded the prisoners that a bigger war was still raging beyond the barbed wire. It wasn't through newspapers or radios. There were no headlines here, no official announcements. It came through sound. Distant explosions, low rumbles in the night, echoes carried on the wind. For prisoners trapped behind fences, hearing the war was like listening to a storm you couldn't see, terrifying, mysterious, and strangely full of hope. The first rumblings. The first time prisoners heard gunfire in the distance, everyone froze. Some ran to the windows of the barracks. Others crouched low, terrified the battle had reached the camp itself. But the guards? They stood calmly, pretending not to notice. And that silence told prisoners more than any announcement ever could. The war is close, but not here. Not yet. From then on, everyone listened differently. Every shout, every faint rumble, every sudden silence became clues about what was happening outside. When the sky spoke. Sometimes the sound came from above. Heavy aircraft passed overhead, engines roaring like thunder. Prisoners lay awake, staring at the ceilings, imagining the bombs falling miles away. On clear nights, they could see faint flashes of light far beyond the camp, distant cities burning silently on the horizon. One man whispered to his friend,
"It sounds closer tonight." The friend replied softly, "Good. It means someone's fighting for us." Even destruction could carry hope, depending on which side of the fence you were on. The rumor chain. Whenever a loud explosion or distant gunfire echoed, rumors exploded faster than the bombs. "I heard the Allies are nearby." Someone said the front line moved past the river. A guard told someone the war will end in 2 weeks. None of it could be confirmed. Half of it was probably wrong. But in a place where information was scarce, rumors became survival fuel. One prisoner joked, "If rumors won wars, we'd have been free last year." Everyone laughed, softly of course. The changing moods of guards. Interestingly, prisoners didn't just listen to sounds, they listened to people, especially the guards. If the guards were relaxed and joking, the war was probably far away. If the guards whispered nervously, smoked more than usual, or kept checking the horizon, everyone knew something big was happening. Sometimes prisoners could tell who was winning the war just by watching the guards' faces. One man said later, "When they shouted louder, I knew we were losing. When they went quiet, I knew we were winning." Explosions in the night. The scariest sounds came late at night. When the camp was silent and dark, a sudden distant boom could feel enormous. People sat up in bed listening, counting the seconds between rumbles like you would during a thunderstorm. Sometimes the ground trembled faintly, just enough to remind everyone that the outside world wasn't safe either. And yet, strangely, for some prisoners, those booms brought comfort. Each explosion meant the war was moving, and if the war moved, freedom moved closer too. The dogs and the bells. Not all sounds came from battles. Some came from inside the camp, carrying meaning of their own. The distant barking of dogs when someone approached the fence. The ringing of the big iron bell when new prisoners arrived. The clatter of boots when guards changed shifts. Over time, prisoners became experts at decoding these noises. A few seconds of barking could tell you where the guards were. The tone of a bell could tell you why people were being called. In a place where spoken words were dangerous, listening became survival. When silence was louder. Sometimes the absence of sound said more than the noises ever could. There were nights when even the guards stopped talking, when the usual dogs went quiet, and even the wind felt heavy. That silence meant one thing: something big was happening. Prisoners would lie awake, staring into darkness, wondering, is the front line moving? Are we being evacuated? Will freedom come tomorrow or danger? In those moments, silence felt louder than any explosion.
Songs that gave strength. While the outside world roared with chaos, inside the camp, prisoners created their own sounds to fight fear. Soft humming at night. Quiet folk songs from childhood. Whispered prayers carried across beds. Sometimes, entire barracks joined in, voices rising just enough to drown out distant bombs. One prisoner said, "The world outside was burning, but inside we sang like it was still alive." Even when the fences didn't move, music made the soul feel freer. The day the sky caught fire. One evening, the camp watched as the horizon lit up, bright orange flashes followed by deep rolling thunder. It wasn't close enough to threaten them, but it was close enough to see the war happening in real time. The guards barked orders, pulling everyone inside. But prisoners crowded by the windows anyway, pressing their faces to the glass. For the first time in years, some of them felt something dangerous, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Hope. Because if the war had reached this far, then maybe, just maybe, the fences wouldn't stand much longer. A war you could only hear. The strangest part was living next to a war without ever seeing it. Prisoners heard stories about towns falling, armies advancing, victories and defeats, but they saw nothing beyond the barbed wire. For some, it was maddening. For others, it was comforting. Not seeing the battle meant you could pretend, just for a little while, that the world was still safe. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The closer the sounds came, the closer everything. Freedom, chaos, life, and death approached too. The day the sounds stopped. One morning, something strange happened. Silence. No distant gunfire, no rumbling, no aircraft overhead. The whole camp woke up uneasy. Hours later, whispers spread. Something big happened last night. Nobody knew if it was good or bad, but everyone knew the war had shifted. And for the first time, guards looked nervous too. That silence changed everything. Holding on to every echo. In a place without radios, televisions, or newspapers, the war lived in echoes. Prisoners clung to every sound. Distant blasts, guard whispers, moving trucks, ringing bells. Sometimes those sounds brought fear. Sometimes they brought hope. But above all, they reminded everyone of one thing. The outside world was still moving, even if they weren't. And as long as the world moved, freedom remained possible. For years, life inside the prison camp felt endless. The same fences, the same roll calls, the same hunger. Many prisoners secretly believed they might never see freedom again. And then, one morning, everything changed. The strange silence. It started with silence. The guards didn't shout at roll call. Their boots still crunched on gravel, but their voices were quieter, more uncertain. Some prisoners noticed nervous glances, hurried movements, and whispered conversations between officers. Something was different. Something was coming. The first signs. By midday, the sounds of war grew louder than ever before. Explosions rumbled closer, and the sky shook with distant artillery. Guards grew restless. Some yelled louder than usual, while others simply avoided eye contact. A few disappeared altogether, slipping away quietly when no one was looking. Prisoners exchanged silent glances. Hearts beat faster. Could it be? Was this the moment they had dreamed of every night? And then, it happened. The gates that had trapped them for so long were thrown open. Some camps were liberated by advancing soldiers storming past fleeing guards. Others were simply abandoned, with watchtowers left empty and gates swinging loose. At first, nobody moved. Prisoners stared, too stunned to believe it. For years, stepping beyond those fences meant punishment. Now, suddenly, the way was clear. One man whispered, "Is it a trick?" But then, slowly, cautiously, people stepped forward. And just like that, the prisoners became free men and women again. The flood of emotion. The moment was overwhelming. Some prisoners laughed, unable to stop. Others cried openly, collapsing onto the muddy ground. A few simply stood still, blinking in disbelief, as if their bodies couldn't process what freedom felt like. Hugs were everywhere, strangers clinging to each other as if they'd been family for life. Friends who had carried each other through sickness and hunger now held one another tighter than ever before. For the first time in years, tears were not a sign of weakness. They were a sign of life. The outside world. Crossing the camp's edge was surreal. For so long, prisoners had stared at trees, fields, and skies from behind barbed wire. Now they could walk into it. Some fell to their knees, pressing their hands into the dirt just to feel grass again. Others looked up at the wide sky, free of fences, and whispered prayers of thanks. Freedom didn't come with fanfare. It came with the simple, quiet gift of space. Reuniting and searching. After liberation, the chaos didn't end. In fact, it only grew. Some prisoners were reunited with families almost immediately, parents embracing children, husbands and wives clinging to each other with joy that words couldn't capture. But for many, the search began. Homes were gone. Families had moved or perished. Letters had stopped long ago. One woman later said, "I walked out of the camp free, but into a world that no longer knew me." The body remembers. Freedom didn't erase the scars. Years of hunger left bodies frail and weak. People walked slowly, ribs visible, hands shaking even as they reached for bread offered by rescuers. Some couldn't finish their first proper meal. Their stomachs had forgotten how to handle real food. Others broke down in tears simply holding a piece of fresh fruit again. The fences were gone, but the body remembered every single day spent inside them. The mind remembers too. If the body healed slowly, the mind healed even slower. Many prisoners couldn't sleep in silence anymore. Silence reminded them of roll calls, punishments, and fear. Some hoarded bread under their pillows long after the war ended, afraid it might disappear in the night. Nightmares followed them for years, but so did hope, because even broken hearts kept beating. The kindness of strangers. Liberation wasn't just about gates opening. It was also about people on the outside reaching in. Locals brought food, blankets, and clothes to the newly freed. Soldiers offered water, medicine, and sometimes just a smile that said, "It's over now." One survivor recalled, "The first real kindness I saw after years was a soldier giving me chocolate. I hadn't tasted chocolate since I was a child. I cried before I even took a bite." Sometimes the smallest gestures meant the most. Not all stories ended the same. For some, liberation was the happiest day of their lives. For others, it was complicated. Walking free didn't erase the pain, the losses, the people left behind in unmarked graves. Survivors carried guilt. Why did I live when they didn't? A weight heavier than any chain. Freedom didn't mean forgetting. Freedom meant carrying those memories into the future, telling their stories so the world would know what had happened. The camps left behind. After liberation, many camps were abandoned, left standing as silent reminders. Empty barracks, rusting fences, broken watchtowers. Some prisoners returned years later, walking through the ruins. The silence was eerie, but the memories were louder than ever. One man said, "The fences were gone, but I could still hear the boots. I could still hear the hunger." For survivors, the camps never truly disappeared. They lived on in memory, in scars, in whispered stories told to children and grandchildren. What freedom taught them? Despite the pain, liberation brought one powerful lesson: human spirit survives. Prisoners who walked out of those camps carried more than scars. They carried resilience, compassion, and the knowledge that even in the darkest places, kindness and hope had not died. One survivor explained it best. They took my freedom. They tried to take my dignity, but they never took my soul. Walking out of that camp proved it. The dawn after darkness. The day the gates opened was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. Prisoners became survivors. Survivors became witnesses, and their memories became warnings for the world. As one woman said years after walking free, liberation didn't erase the pain, but it gave me the chance to live again. And that is the greatest gift anyone can have.
The fences are gone now. The watchtowers stand empty. The boots that once marched through the gravel have long since fallen silent. But for the people who lived inside those camps, the memories never fully left. They carried them home, into their families, their futures, and even into the quiet moments of their old age. And in those memories, we find reflections not only of suffering, but also of survival, kindness, and strength. The stories that stayed. Survivors often said they didn't remember every detail, not every guard, not every day of labor. What stayed with them were moments. A stolen piece of bread shared between friends. A soft song hummed at night. A letter tucked under a pillow. The laughter that somehow managed to survive even in the darkest places. One man put it simply, "What I remember most is not the pain, but the people who helped me through it." The burden of memory. Of course, not all memories were gentle. Many survivors struggled with guilt. Guilt for living when others didn't. Guilt for not being able to save friends. Guilt for walking away while names faded in silence. But with time, many realized something important. Remembering was not guilt. It was responsibility. Every story told became a way of carrying those who didn't survive into the future. Every memory shared kept their dignity alive. Lessons of humanity. What did the camps teach? More than anyone ever wished to learn. They taught that cruelty can exist anywhere, but so can kindness. They taught that hunger can weaken the body, but hope can still strengthen the soul. They taught that even when the world tries to erase you, you can still hold on to your humanity. One survivor said it, "I walked in a prisoner, I walked out a witness."
The quiet heroes. Not everyone who saved lives did it with grand gestures. Some simply offered a sip of water when someone was dying of thirst. Some covered a sick friend at roll call so the guards wouldn't notice. Some whispered prayers over strangers they didn't even know. These quiet acts of courage rarely made it into history books, but for those who experienced them, they meant everything. The power of small things. Looking back, survivors often reflected on the smallest details. A spoonful of sugar in a parcel, a scarf left behind by a guard, a rumor that the war might end soon. Tiny, ordinary things carried enormous meaning inside the fences. They weren't just objects or words. They were reminders that life, in all its simplicity, still existed somewhere beyond the camp. When silence speaks. Many survivors struggled to talk about their experiences right after the war. Some stayed silent for decades. The pain was too deep, the memories too raw. But silence itself became part of the story. Sometimes, just sitting in a room with someone who had been there, without a single word spoken, carried more weight than any history book ever could. Later, when they did speak,
Their words became warnings. Never again. The strange gift of perspective. Survivors often said the camps changed the way they saw the world forever. A warm meal wasn't just food, it was a miracle. A soft bed wasn't just comfort, it was luxury. The sound of children laughing wasn't just noise, it was proof that life had gone on. One woman explained it this way: after you've starved, you never take bread for granted again. After you've been silenced, you never take laughter for granted again. Faith in tomorrow. Even after everything, many survivors carried one quiet belief: tomorrow was worth waiting for. They had learned that life could change in a single day. One moment you were trapped behind fences, the next the gates swung open. That belief carried into the rest of their lives. Whenever they faced hardship later on, they reminded themselves, if I survived the camp, I can survive this too. Telling the world. Some survivors wrote books, some gave interviews, some spoke to classrooms full of children. Others never shared their stories publicly, but passed them down to their families quietly, around kitchen tables at night. Each story carried the same message: remember. Because forgetting wasn't an option. Forgetting meant the fences could rise again somewhere else. Remembering meant the world had a chance to do better. The legacy of kindness. When asked what stayed with them the most, many survivors didn't speak of guards or punishments. They spoke of friends. The one who gave away half his bread. The one who sat awake all night during a fever. The one who made everyone laugh even when laughter felt impossible. In the end, the legacy of the camps wasn't just about suffering. It was also about the power of kindness in the darkest places. The gentle closing. As old age came, many survivors found themselves lying in soft beds, surrounded by families, listening to the quiet ticking of clocks instead of the barking of guards. And in those final years, they often looked back not just with pain, but with a strange kind of peace. Because they had survived, because they had witnessed, because they had turned suffering into stories, and stories into lessons. Final reflection. The camps are gone, but the memories remain. And when we listen to them, we hear not only of cruelty and loss, but also of resilience, compassion, and hope. One survivor said it best, with words simple enough for anyone to carry to bed at night. We were caged, but not broken. We were hungry, but not empty. We were prisoners, but we never stopped being human. And perhaps that is the deepest reflection of all.